He's Bob Costas. Bob did not retire yesterday, by the way. The only reason why I wanted to have Bob on, he's stepping down with his Olympic duties and maybe a little bit with Football Night in America. Bob, did you add more work to my plate? That's all I want to know.
To your plate?
Yeah.
I don't think so, because you're not involved in Thursday night football, and there will still be Sunday night football, so I think you're good.
Good. All right. Well, thanks for
Unless
joining us.
you're looking for work, in which case I can put in a word for you.
And just so people know, you're not retiring.
No, not retiring. I just felt that after doing a dozen Olympics at this point, it just felt like enough. I could have continued, but it's always better to step aside on your own terms. And this will allow me to do a bit more baseball for the Major League Baseball Network. And maybe if the right situation comes along, not right away, but maybe if the right situation comes along, do more of the long-form type programming that I used to do, sometimes in sports, sometimes out, like back in the days of the later show in late night on NBC, or some of the stuff I used to do on HBO or on NBC's news magazines, if that opportunity comes along.
What are you going to miss most about the Olympics?
It sounds corny, but at this point, having done a dozen of them, what I'll miss the most is the colleagues and the people I work with, many of whom I grew up with in the business, many of whom have been friends of mine for 30 years or more. And being the person who, at least in prime time, carries the ball for the people who work so hard, not just those, and you've been around it enough to see people working these 18 or 20-hour days, but it's all the months and years leading up to it. A lot of them traveling the world to collect the features and the information and the background on athletes from more than 200 countries, if we're talking about the Summer Olympics. Being at the center of that and surrounded by so many people who are so dedicated to the task, I think that's the part that I'll miss the most.
When did you know that you kind of settled in and this is what you wanted to do or meant to do? When, because you, as I said yesterday, it's not easy what you do, but to be able to make it look easier than what it should be, did you get to a point where you said, okay, I've kind of settled in, I figured this out?
I don't know that you ever figure it out 100%, because it's impossible to do perfectly. It's such a vast undertaking, and there's so many different expectations and perspectives on it. But after the Barcelona Olympics in '92, which was my second one and my first one as the primetime host, and it was pretty well received, I began to feel more comfortable with it. It's interesting, though, because I don't know about you, but as much as I admired Jim McKay, and I truly admired him, and I was lucky to call him a friend during the last 15 years or so of his life, as much as I admired him, I never thought hosting the Olympics was my professional goal. I thought calling baseball games or basketball games or something like that. And one thing just kind of led to another, and the next thing you know, a dozen Olympics.
You got to a point, though, where you were comfortable enough, or the network allowed you that freedom to have an opinion. Mm-hmm. Was that ever discussed, or was that just a natural progression that I feel it, I see it, I say it?
It was sometimes discussed, because there was always a tightrope to walk. Relationships with the IOC, relationships with the home country, especially if that country was an authoritarian nation. I mean, I understood the differing priorities. If you were running NBC Sports, a gigantic investment is involved here, billions of dollars when you consider the rights fees and the production costs and everything else. And while they were willing to let me speak my mind or ask pointed questions in an interview, maybe more than someone else would be inclined to do, there was sometimes a point that they didn't want me to go beyond, and then there'd be a behind-the-scenes negotiations and a little bit of pushback, and you kind of settled somewhere in the middle sometimes.
What do you think about Los Angeles getting the Olympics, and if the travel ban with President Trump, how that is going to impact this vote, since they're going to be voting on it now, but then you're going to have the, it's not, for what, 2024?
Yeah, people think it's far down the road, and it is 7 years down the road, but the vote, the decision, is just around the corner. And we can only guess. There's so many different constituencies within the IOC, we can only guess how some of them will feel about American policies and President Trump's initiatives and what effect that might have on Los Angeles' chances. I'll say this, from where I sit, Los Angeles is probably the city best situated to pull it off because it has so many usable venues spread all around L.A. And now add to that, no matter what you think of Stan Kroenke leaving St. Louis and building his new sports mecca in the Los Angeles area, that adds more facilities. So I think they're better situated to pull it off than the other cities that are bidding for it, but there's always politics involved.
Yeah, I was told that they might swap it and have Paris go before Los Angeles because of the travel ban and voting on it. Have you heard anything, and what do you think about that possibility?
Well, and again, I don't want to speak out of my depth here, but Paris has issues of its own. One issue is not the setting itself. It's spectacular to have an Olympics in Paris and have the Eiffel Tower and the Champs-Élysées and the Louvre and all the rest as some of the backdrops, but they have had their own problems with terrorism and indigenous terrorists. There may be more of them per capita in some European cities than there are in the United States, and security is an ever-growing concern. So that's going to be among the things, the questions, I guess, that those who represent Paris will have to answer for the IOC. So I really, it's a jumble to me, and I guess there's pluses and minuses on either side of it.
Your advice for Mike Tirico, have you given him or will you give him any advice taking over the Olympic throne?
You know, we've spent a good deal of time together, especially lately. And, of course, the first bit of advice is the same bit of advice that every one of us got when we started in the business, no matter what we wanted to do. Just be yourself. And, of course, you can't just be yourself until you've pretty much mastered robotically the basics of the business. And that's when a personal style and a personal touch begins to emerge. Just be yourself is the easiest advice to give and one of the hardest things to do, and it only comes when you become comfortable and confident enough to let your own personality come out. But I think the one bit of solid advice that I've been able to give him is it's important to know what you don't need to know. And after a couple of Olympics, it dawned on me, you know what, no matter how hard you study, no matter how dedicated you are, there's no way you can know every platform diver from Bolivia or every cross-country skier from Finland. And why should you try? The role of the host, and Jim McKay was the guy who pretty much set the template for it. The role of the host is to be a good generalist, to really know the history of the Olympics, to really have some perspective on it, to know a lot about the host city and the host nation, and to know a lot about the 24 or so stories and athletes that are likely to be the focus in prime time. And then if something comes onto the radar screen unexpectedly, the researchers are terrific, and you have to be able to take a briefing quickly and make a narrative out of it, even if you didn't expect that to be part of the story. But if you spend all your days and nights for months leading up to the Olympics trying to memorize every hurdler from Peru, that really is a waste of your time and energy. So put that aside.
So I've been studying the losers from Kazakhstan, so I should not be doing that right now for the Seoul Olympics, is what you're saying.
No, that's the one exception, because losers from Kazakhstan are fascinating to people in Omaha. So I'd stay on that.
I'll let you go with this. With baseball in the lower levels, the minor leagues thinking about putting a runner on second base to start extra innings. Your thought about baseball trying to speed up play, tinkering a little bit with this idea?
I'm good with speeding up play, but once a game goes to extra innings, you want it decided the way a baseball game is decided. The sport that really needs to think not so much about pace of play, but about how they decide games that go to overtime or the equivalent of extra innings is football.
Yeah.
And the fact that you get an exciting ending should not obscure how utterly ridiculous the NFL's overtime rules are. And this is not an anti-Patriot thing. The Patriots had a great comeback, and over the course of nearly 2 decades now, they've been just a remarkable story, one of the great franchises in the history of sports, and what Brady did is off the chart. But suppose the flip had gone the other way, and suppose arguably the greatest quarterback in NFL history, after the greatest comeback in Super Bowl history, never touched the ball in overtime. That's what happened to Matt Ryan the other night. It happened twice in the playoffs the previous 2 years to Aaron Rodgers, one of the best quarterbacks ever. And the rough equivalent of that would be if in the World Series, in the seventh game of the World Series, since every playoff game in football is the equivalent of a seventh game in other sports, seventh game of the World Series, you're in extra innings. If the visiting team scores in the top of the inning on a home run, game over. But if they score on a scratch single or a sacrifice fly, then the home team gets to bat in the bottom of the inning. It's absurd on its face. And I knew that eventually, I don't know how they dodged the bullet this long, but eventually it was going to come back to bite them in a Super Bowl. And it did. It's just a dumb way to conclude a great game.
Well, this is a way to conclude this interview as well, Bob. So, hey, thank you for all the advice with the Olympics, and you'll be missed, but I'm sure you'll be around.
I'll be around. Thanks, Dan.
Thank you, bud. That's Bob Costas, Major League Baseball Network, and still contributing to NBC.
The Dan Patrick Show, weekday mornings on Audience.